Okay, welcome. This week, welcome to GV311. This week we're going to hear from Professor Patrick Dunleavy on the UK party system and party politics. Just read the title of the first slide. And actually this is the first of a two-week presentation on this subject, so come back again next week. We haven't really talked about the party system at all thus far, so this will give us a great opportunity to hear not only about the British party system, but of course at a time when it is changing out of all recognition. I read in a poll this very day, I don't want to steal your thunder, about further advances. Actually, it's not a poll, it's about growth in the Green Party membership. So without steering Patrick's thunder, we are at a time of extraordinary change in terms of Britain's famous two-party system. Patrick.
Thanks. Well, good evening. So what I'm going to talk about is the concept of a party system. And this is a little bit complicated because it's not just a set of parties. I mean, so you need to think of it as a system that hangs together where all the bits interconnect one with another. And that's really what it is about. Sorry, this one's a bit cut off, but this one at least shows you the top of the thing. So the first three things are the things I'm going to talk about mainly today, which is how voters behave, how electoral institutions matter because they affect which party does well, which party does badly. And particularly, as you all know, Britain has what's often called a first-past-the-post system of elections. This is misleading because there is in fact no post. And the correct way to think about it is a plurality rule election. And a plurality just means that we divide the country into 646 constituencies. In each area we add up the votes for all the candidates. Whoever has the largest number of votes wins the seat. A plurality just means more votes than anybody else. So there's no winning post because it depends how many candidates stand. For example, if you have 10 candidates, support is very evenly divided. In theory, somebody with 11 or 12% could win the seat. And at some point in time, we have had people winning seats with 25, 24% of the vote in multi-party contests. So that's a very old voting system. It's been around in England since medieval times. We've gifted it to the whole of the British Empire with fairly catastrophic results in large parts, but it's still going strong, at least in India and in the USA. So that's an electoral institution, plurality rule voting in single-member districts. And traditionally it has, as Tony has already mentioned, protected the Conservative and Labour parties against new competitors and given them both, usually, many more seats nationwide than their share of the vote would normally justify. And of course it has allowed British governments to be formed that don't command the assent of a majority of people. The current government is a very rare exception. It's got 54% of the electorate backed it at the last election. But typically, governments before that have had 42, 40%, or in the case of the last Labour government, 36% support. And that's been enough to give them majorities in the House of Commons. So compared with most of Western Europe, this is a very strange and odd-looking system of elections. It's also very old-fashioned, hasn't been reformed. British voters had a chance to reform it to accept the Australian system called the Alternative Vote in 2011. They decisively rejected that by 2-1. So that's been the electoral system, and for a long time it's gone along with a particular pattern of party ideologies and cleavages. Historically, Conservatives were a sort of pro-business, middle-class supported party which actually drew perhaps 30% of their support from the working class. Labour was historically the insurgent party of the working class and perhaps the lower middle class. So that's the historic background. Well, those are the bits I'm going to talk about today. And next week, I'm going to look at the system of government and how that affects parties' behaviour, how parties recruit elites, what they do in office and what they do in opposition, and finally, how much we can think of parties as shaping public policy, which they probably do in the UK more than many other countries in the world. But basically, I'm going to focus on the red topics now. And these topics all involve looking at numbers. So we can't get away from the fact that you have to look at some graphs and some charts and some tables and think about quantities. All right? Now, I know there are probably some people in the room who don't like thinking about numbers. But it would really help me if anybody has any trouble with any of the numbers or anything isn't crystal clear. I'm going to throw a lot of things at you if you ask me questions as we go along. On the other hand, if you think I don't understand the numbers, you could say that for the question time. Right. So the first thing I want to talk about is a law-like proposition, which some people think is the only law in political science, named after a guy called Maurice Duverger, formulated in 1955, which basically says plurality rule election systems, such as the one we have here, produce two-party politics. That's the essential guts of the law. And as Tony mentioned, this totally does not apply to the UK now, hasn't applied for about 30 years. The press have sort of caught up just in the last couple of years, but partly because Parliament looks very two-party still. But elections are not two-party in Britain. Then we'll think about how to characterise the current trends, and I'm going to spend the last part of the lecture just looking at two things which you need to think a lot about. One is the concept of disproportionality, which protects the existing main parties. And then the other thing is the fact that Britain has, since 1997, transformed into a multi-tier polity. So it used to be a unitary nation state, along with New Zealand, perhaps the most unitary of all nation states. But now it's multi-tier, especially in terms of elections. And when you have different elections run on different systems at different tiers, that tends to increase the number of parties worldwide, and it certainly has in the UK, in a very specific way that we'll explore. So that's what I'm going to cover. Now, let's just start with Duverger's law. So Maurice Duverger formulated this in the mid-50s, in the high point of the post-war boom. He was a French political sociologist, and he called it a law, even though it's not really a law at all, but it's been very addictive ever since. Political scientists, you know, the dictum that says anything with science in its name isn't. So political science, computer science, whatever, information science. Well, people who have science in their name are always looking for things that make them look more scientific, and a law is one of those things that sounds very attractive. And it seemed to be, in the mid-1950s, it seemed to work quite well. Britain, the USA, India, quite a lot of countries seemed to fit relatively well with this concept. But gradually, as time went on, it became a worse and worse fit. And so the people who believe in this law, and there are still numerous, including apparently every American political scientist that there is, believes in this law, they started saying, oh, well, Duverger never meant that at the level of the whole nation, there would only be two parties. He only meant that at the level of each individual constituency, where you have a plurality rule, there would only be two parties. So that allowed for the fact that, for example, in Canada, there were French parties, and in many regions of India, there began to be special local or regional parties, in addition to the big parties. And so that's really what the law is framed as now. And there is an additional hypothesis that the Deviation mentioned, which says that it's not as fixed and as predictive and as rigid, really, but it says that the more permissive the electoral system is, the more proportional it is, the more the number of parties competing at elections will tend to be larger. So this is the hypothesis. Okay. Now, how does this work? This is a very detailed slide, so I'm not going to try and expect you to read it. But basically, Deviation had two effects. One is called the mechanical effect. And basically, this means that if a third, fourth, or fifth party stands in an election against the big two parties, they will be treated very unfairly. They will get lots of votes, they will get no seats, and the leaders and the voters for these parties will realize that they're on a kind of no-hope ticket. That's the mechanical effect. So the mechanical effect is that, for example, in Britain, if you stand in the election, if you get millions of votes across the country, but you come second, third, or fourth in every seat of the country, you can win no seats at all, despite having a very substantial proportion of the overall national vote. So that's the mechanical effect. And the psychological effect is that elites don't form these new parties because they think, if I go out of the main party or if I try and form a party against the main parties, I'll just be wasting my time and my effort and my donors' money, so why bother? And then at election time itself, voters don't vote for these parties because they think this will be a wasted vote. And in the sense that it will be cast for a party that has no chance of winning, certainly no chance of influencing the shape of the overall national government. So the important thing is that we should expect that there won't be elites who want to form parties other outside of the top two parties. Or at least, if they do form a party, they'll have a go, they'll fail, then they'll stop. Because maybe they'll have a go twice, banging their head against the wall, then they'll say, ouch, that hurts, and stop. Right? So we shouldn't have a lot of candidates for people to vote for. That's the first prediction. And the second prediction is, even if there are a lot of candidates for people to vote for, voters won't back them unless they're in the big two, because they'll see it as a wasted vote. Right? So those are the two twin effects that we should be looking out for. And I'm going to introduce a couple of extra bits on Deviation's law to just show you that it's going strong. So a very influential and interesting and important American political scientist called Andrew Cox updated the law in 1997. And so now it says, for any electoral system, the maximum number of candidates who should be contesting the election is the size of the electoral district plus one. So you should never have more parties contesting the election than the size of the electoral district plus one more. So if we had, let's say, a 10-party seat, the law says there shouldn't be more than 11 candidates. And if we have, as we do in the UK, one-member seats, we shouldn't ever have more than 2 candidates contesting the election. Now, he did sort of, he did kind of give himself wriggle room against this law being refuted by saying, by the way, this only refers to the number of candidates in each district, so we're not saying anything about how many parties really will stand nationwide. So we could have 2-member parties contesting seats in every seat in the country, 646 seats, 2 times 646 says we should never see more than 1,292 parties competing. pretty safe ground there, Andrew. Yeah, so the question is, how nationalised is the party system? And he discusses a whole range of institutions that might affect that, like, for example, having a presidential system tends to nationalise your party system because there's only a single office at the apex of the political order, and therefore it tends to come down to much fewer parties. Whereas if you have a very representative, proportional representative parliament, we could have more diversity of parties influencing public policy. Okay, so that's the update, and that's what we really need to think about. Does Duverger's law apply in the UK? And the only counter-argument that is really very well founded is by two American political scientists, again, Ken Dixon and who's the Sheave, anyway, I've forgotten his first name. So they basically say, well, actually, supposing you have a situation like this, where we have, let's say, a left and a right dimension. And then we have a constituency that is divided between people with a left and right view. And let's supposing that the right wing are in the majority, say 70-30. Okay? All right? So we've got 70% of people are sort of right wing, 30% are left wing. Now, according to Duverger's law, everybody in the right should vote for a single party. But Dixon and Sheave point out that the 70% could split into two, and even if they split exactly equally, 35 in each half, they would still beat the opposition. So, for example, supposing the 70% was very right-wing, and they split at this point here. So we now had, let's say, 45% here, 25% there. The 45% are going to win because they are bigger than everybody else, and their candidate is likely to be much more right-wing here than he would have been, or she would have been, if the 70% hadn't split. So that delivers political goodies for everybody on the right, and rationally, they should always split. The implication of this is that we should never see any election district with more than a 67% vote for the leading party. If it's 70%, anything above that, it should split. It would be irrational for voters, they argue, not to split into two parties. For example, not to split between the Conservatives and UKIP. Right? So we can look at this and just see if we see any party winning seats with more than 67% of the vote. If we do, then Duverger's law is alive and well. If we don't, the Dixon and Sheave argument looks more interesting. Okay, so the question is, how do we look at this? And this is where you have to sort of look at a graph. Okay, so this graph shows you, I'm going to go over here, along the bottom axis, the extent to which the top national party is ahead of the second party nationwide in a given seat, in every local seat. For example, if it was Labour ahead, then they would be, how much are they ahead of the Conservatives? They might be 0 because they would be very tied, or they might be 90% because it was a solid.
So this is the last, just to check I've got this, Patrick, the last election, that would have been comparing the Conservatives on 36 with,
yes,
at the national level, Labour with 29.
Exactly. So that's what we're measuring on the bottom axis. So the top national party is ahead of the second national party, is all on that side. The second national party is ahead of the top national party in some seats. That's all on this side. All right? And then the vertical axis, these numbers going up here, and this label here, shows the total vote going to all the parties other than the top two parties. So the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and so on. Right? Everybody except the top two parties nationally. Now, what should we expect to see? If Duverger's law is right, we should be really far down here. We shouldn't be going up the graph at all, right? And we should expect to see a big, nice, wide spread across the bottom of the graph here. We should see some seats where people are getting more than 2/3 of the vote. And we should always see that most seats are in the pink or the blue bit here, right? So that's what we're looking for. The Duverger's law picture will be right along the bottom. It will go past the 67% mark, no trouble. Won't take any notice of that. It will be very low down, and every seat, even if it's up there, will be in the pink or the blue areas.
So again, just to check I've got that right. So that would mean that there would be some seats where Labour had 80% of the vote and the Conservatives 20, and no intervention by another party in effect.
Yes, well, if we take that account from last time,
Yep.
Labour 80%, Conservative 20, that gives you a Labour lead of 60%.
Yep.
It'll be down here on the bottom.
Right on the
axis.
bottom, yeah.
All right? Now, you're probably thinking, I don't understand that, but we can look at one totally pure, classic, super Duvergerian system, which is the USA. It's the most super Duvergerian system in the world, and this is what it looks like. So you can see the black dots are different seats. Most of them are piled up down here right on the bottom axis, i.e. they're just Democrat versus Republican contests. Nobody else even bothers to enter the race. And even if they do enter the race, they get just a couple of percent. You go right past the 67% line, you don't take any notice of that. Almost everything is in the blue or the red shaded areas. There's just a few odd-looking seats up here and up here. And these are where the major parties couldn't get anybody to spend a few £1 million losing to their main rival. So suddenly, you know, the Democrats are very far ahead of the Republicans. The Republicans couldn't get anybody to stand in this area, so this other person here is the Libertarian candidate who's getting all the Republican votes. That would normally do. But that's the only exception. Everything else is down here, and there's nothing in here. And there's certainly nothing up there. Right? That would be unthinkable. Now, it's not just Congress that this applies to. There are hundreds and thousands of elections in the USA every 5 years, and all of them pretty well reveal this pattern, down to county level, even down to electing judges in some area. So it's a very super Duvergerian system. Everything that Duverger said applies very well to the USA. But let's look at just one other thing before we start looking at any British data, which is the pattern for India, where we have the 2004 general election, BJP ahead of Congress, Congress ahead of BJP. Now, you can see this is a completely different party system. And when you bear in mind that there were 43 parties represented in the Indian parliament, and that the ruling coalition formed after this election was, I think, had 18 members in it, 18 different parties in the ruling coalition. You can see that this is the biggest plurality rule voting system in the world, but it's not at all Duvergerian, or it's not wholly Duvergerian. There is a big cluster of seats that you can see here. So that's quite a big bunch of seats. Then we've got a big bunch of seats being with the two major parties winning, but with less than majority support in their local area. And then we've got a huge bunch of seats at the top where regional and local and communist and third parties are winning. And you can also see that there are no seats, virtually no seats, with more than 67% going to the top party. So the Dixon and Sheave argument applies very well in India. So that gives you two different plurality rule systems, and we're going to think about, well, how does Britain compare? And let's start back in the 1950s, 1955, the height of two-party politics in Britain. And you can see that there are a very large bunch of seats right down here where there's just votes for the two parties. There's no votes for any other party. In many cases, this is because no other party stood. The Liberals stood candidates in some seats, and these you can see up here. There's one or two Scottish National candidates and things like that. The Liberals even won one or two seats up at the top in the Scottish Highlands, but basically 96% of the seats went to the Conservative or Labour parties, and we just had a sprinkling of like more old-fashioned and odd kind of seats where the Liberals were still going. So that's 1955, and you can see that's not as super Deviatian as the US. It's a little bit of competition, but it was clearly a predominantly two-party system. And now, where are we? Well, the interesting thing about this picture from 2004 is that 2005, sorry, is that there's nobody on the bottom line at all. Everybody's shifted 10, 15% up. There's hardly anybody with more than 67% of the votes. The big, old, solid party bastions that were there in 1955 have gone away. There's a very large number of seats being won by MPs who don't have majority support in their local constituency. Only the ones that are in the pink area and the blue area and maybe the orange area, more tricky there. But the ones in the white area don't have support. And anything in this crown area where there's this purple line could be won by a third party, or it's certainly a three-party competitive seat. So that was 2005. Let's just check 2010. Not an anomaly. This is just the way elections in Britain work out. So it's very, very different from the USA. It's different again from India. Particularly it's different because it's very high up off the bottom floor. We've got about a third of the triangle actually here with nothing in it in the bottom. So Britain is a multi-party system. It's actually been a multi-party system since 1974. And we can look at this in regional detail. I'll leave you to look at these slides at your leisure, but you can see that the same pattern applies. It's not as if it's a very nationalised pattern. There's a bit of a shift. You can see that the southeast is Conservative weighted, the northwest is Labour weighted. Scotland and Wales both have more seats being won by nationalist parties, the SNP and Plaid Cymru, and by Liberals. And then finally, just to show you a table, you can again check this, but the typical seat in the American House of Representatives still has only 2 contenders. Maybe it has 3. The typical seat in an Indian election has 4 or 5. Typical seat in a British election has 4 or 5, but with much more of a weighting on the 5. So if we compare it with other plurality rule elections, it's a very multi-party setup. So let me just pause and just see if anybody wants to ask me any queries or questions before I move on. I'll shift you on in a minute. Any queries or questions? Anything you'd like to run over? Okay, well, let's move on then and look at these 3 points that I'd just like to suggest to you, Britain hasn't been a two-party system since 1974. So if somebody says that to you, they're like 40 years out of date. In terms of voting, Britain now is a pretty standard European liberal democracy. It has pretty much the same range of parties as every other European multi-party system. And the big thing that we need to think about is that voters have been multi-party for a long time, but the system has suppressed systematically for many years the expression of these preferences. So let's just quickly look at the graph on the purple one. Shows you the two-party share of the vote. Hasn't gone down totally dramatically, but it's gone down from 90% to sort of mid-60s. The grey share plus the rather anarchically placed numbers show you how far the two main parties were ahead of the opposition. The orange share shows you the Liberal Democrat vote. You can see it peaked in 1974 and peaked again in 1983 when the Social Democratic and Labour Party was formed and the alliance contested the elections. And then the interesting thing perhaps is the all other parties thing, which has been growing. But this is just in general election votes, which we'll see the picture has changed radically since 2010. And again, you can think of this in terms of if we look at seats where the Labour and Conservative vote share has been like this. This is that axis. We can see that coming down, and this shows you the number of seats where the Conservatives and Labour, the proportion of seats where the Conservatives and Labour are the top two parties. Big slump in 1983, big previous slump in 1974, bit of a resurgence under Blair, and then it comes back again. So it's not been totally smooth. We've got quite a bumpy decline. But here's a picture that tells 1,000 words, which is who won seats in the European Parliament election, who was running top in the European Parliament election. So you can see the blue is Conservatives, the red is Labour. This lilac colour is UKIP. And so they're running top in lots of local authority areas, especially in the east and down in the southwest, sort of farming areas. They're also doing quite well in Cheshire and those sorts of areas. That sort of really eats into the Tory heartland that normally is all blue down here. These are the Labour areas in the big cities and in Wales and in Scotland. And then the dark purple is the SNP running first.
You mean 2014, do you?
Do I mean 2014? No, I mean 2013, don't I? 2014.
It's the 14, it's this year.
14, yes.
In fairness, the source says, just check I'm not losing my mind.
Yes, I'm sorry. Why did I say 2013? Yeah. Okay, so we'll have to change these slides, yeah. 2014, sorry. So it's pretty up to date from May this year, yeah. Okay, so then let's have a look at the state of the parties. And we can think about this in real number terms. So you can see the major parties are on, this should say 2014 too, are on a bit of a declining thing. The Conservatives got up to 37% in 2010. Not very good record to get. Historically, the Conservatives used to have 44% of the vote across most of the 20th century. Labour was on 36% in 2005, dipped down in 2010, has come back a bit now. Conservatives are down a bit now. But the big change is over here, and the Liberal Democrats entered a coalition with the Conservatives after the 2010 election, and essentially their vote has been shattered. They are on 1/3 of what they were getting at the last general election. Perhaps they'll come up in the campaign, who knows? But that, for a long time, gave Labour a bit of a fillip, but most recently has benefited UKIP. And the interesting thing here is that UKIP did well in 2014, so he got 27.5% of the vote share. A little bit flattering because they were picking up some British National Party votes, but a very big vote share, and they were running top. Now you can see that in the past two general elections, they had actually won 17% of the vote in 2009 and 2004, and then they slumped to 2 or 3% in the general election. But now, with the European election recently, 2014, you can see that they've also managed to retain a very good share of the vote in polling for the Westminster election. And of course, they've now acquired 2 MPs who defected from the Conservative Party and then were re-elected in by-elections. So UKIP has done very well. And the final thing to notice is that the Greens are in there. They did quite well in 2014 in the European Parliament, and they've been running third nationwide amongst students. So as long as students vote, they'll have quite a decent showing, and they're looking as if they're going to run above their previous performance. And some polls have even put them ahead of the Liberal Democrats. So this is a poll average. Okay, so that's a very big change in the party system, the disruptive arrival of UKIP, the failure of the Labour Party really to benefit from opposition, the failure of the Conservatives to get much joy out of being in government, the Liberal Democrats being shattered, and the Greens coming up. So we could think about the party system as looking like this in Britain, in our left-right terms. So we've still got remnants of the British National Party. UKIP has got lots of MEPs and representation in the London Assembly, and now MPs. Conservatives, Liberal Democrats down, being squeezed a bit, Labour and the Greens doing well. Of course, we've still got one Respect MP in Parliament. And then if we think about Scotland, wow, it's changed a lot in Scotland too, with the SNP really becoming the leading party. And if they carry on at the rate that they've been doing the last few weeks, which of course will be very hard for them to do, they could even suddenly switch the whole of Scottish Labour's support, well, a large part of that, could flip over to become Westminster MPs for the SNP, which they've never really managed to do. So that's a very big change. And you can see that it's a left-leaning electorate, really. Scotland and the Scottish Labour Party and the SNP and the Scottish Greens are really quite prominent. Conservatives are well down. UKIP is in there. Liberal Democrats are clinging on. So we've got two really different party systems, and I won't go over the next slide, which just shows you that there's been a lot of change since 2010, because we've discussed that. Other has.
Can I just ask you on the
Yes.
SNP?
Yeah.
You say it's largely a left-leaning electorate, and yet the SNP's Westminster seats that they currently hold are nearly all former Tory seats, apart from one in Dundee, I think if you actually look at it. So I'm just wondering, that this is the SNP's transformation of whether it really is a left-wing party or not. Probably more left-wing under its new leader than its old one. But certainly its Westminster base has been traditionally in rural areas like Perthshire, Moray, Aberdeenshire, and so on, which were all former Tory seats. So I'm just wondering if this left-right divide that you're talking about, if it's just a bit simplistic.
Well, I was reading an interview with Nicola Sturgeon yesterday in which people were saying to her, are you going to be really bad for business? And she was saying, no, I'm a social democrat, she said. And she said it very prominently and then expounded on her philosophy. Since she's the leader of the party, I think we have to take it that that is where the party is. It's certainly more left-wing than the Labour Party in Scotland, which is really quite conservative.
Well, we'll have to wait and see the results of the Scottish Labour Party leadership election, which is likely to be very close between the left-wing candidate Neil Findlay and the establishment candidate Jim Murphy.
Yes, the establishment candidate Jim Murphy is very establishment.
Well, that's his problem. That's why he's being very hard pressed.
But I think the basic point is if you compare the English party system and the Scottish party system, the Scottish party system is much more tilted to the left than the English. We can discuss.
I'm not sure the electorate is.
Well, that's possible, of course. Let's come back to that.
Okay, so let me just move on. Well, why has this changed? And there are really three things that we need to think about. The firstly one is class de-alignment, which just means the extent to which the middle class support the Conservative Party and the working class support the Labour Party. That's the sort of traditional interpretation of that. Basically, that's gone away since particularly since the 1990s. And I'll just show you one slide to demonstrate that. The second thing we need to think about is that there's been a big advent of proportional representation systems into the UK now, including the Supplementary Vote, which is the system used in London for electing the mayor and for all the other mayoral elections in England, also used in the police commissioner elections, the additional member system used in Scotland and Wales, and list PR, which is used in the European elections. So those are all, they're not all PR elections. Additional member system and list PR are proportional. The supplementary vote is not, but they're all different voting systems. That's one big motor of change, and the other is multi-tier elections, electing for the European Parliament and electing for Scotland and Wales and London, and of course Northern Ireland, although that's rather a separate thing. And what American political scientists call this is they call this contagion effects. So the idea is that you have a different party system in Scotland. In the old days, you could insulate that off. What we seem to be about to see is the breaking through of that Scottish party system into Westminster politics. Similarly, in the old days, you might have had a different party system in Europe. European elections, people might come out and voted against Europe in European elections and then gone back to voting Conservative or Labour in Westminster elections. But now we seem to see that progressively breaking down, and we get this contagion of UKIP votes morphing from being a Euro-only election phenomenon to being a Westminster election phenomenon as well. So let's just run through those three things. Just to show you the class basis of British politics, where you can see that you can go down, up and down the occupational classes. We can see a little bit of variation, 39 to 31% in every group of voting Conservative. This is rather a problematic opinion poll category, unskilled, manual, and not working. It's a little bit of a residual category. You can see a bigger Labour vote there, but then pretty much flat Labour vote. The other areas, pretty flat Liberal Democrat vote up there, but lower there, and then more support for other parties down here. So essentially, not huge differences. You've got to remember, even as little as 10 or 12 years ago, people were writing textbooks which contained a quote from a guy called David Butler, which went, "Class is the basis of British politics. Everything else is embellishment or detail." Maybe it was Anthony King. Anyway, it's not the basis of British politics now, and everything else is not embellishment or detail. There's still some class voting, but it's relatively small scale as an influence. So then we want to think about deviation from proportionality, and the idea here is the degree of protection for the Conservative and Labour parties. And this is just a little score that we do, and all you have to do the score is you take the percentage of votes for each party, take the percentage of seats, you calculate the difference, then add up all the numbers, but ignoring the plus or minus signs, otherwise they just cancel out, and then divide by 2. So, votes, seats, deviations, we add them all up, ignoring the plus or minus signs, divide by 2, we get this thing called the deviation from proportionality. You can think of that as being the percentage of people in the House of Commons who are sitting there occupying seats to which their national share of the vote wouldn't entitle them, right? So how many of them are there, if you like, under false pretenses in national vote share terms? Well, this is what happens in general elections, and it's a pretty high level of deviation from proportionality. So the range, the minimum practical level that you get to here is about 4%. You know, even if you had a very perfectly operating proportional representation system, 4% of the votes would be misallocated. So we need to think about that as being a very, very good performance. And then the question is, what do we think about 21, 22, 21, 23% of the votes going to parties that voters haven't voted for in the national share of the vote? I'd say that's pretty poor. It's amongst the highest in the world. And I should point out that in the USA, although they have the same voting system as us, it's very proportional. The DV score in the USA would be about 7%. So this is 3 times as big as the USA score. So those are the general elections in red. And then if we add in the more recent elections for the European Parliament, I've got with the E's, and then the Scottish, Welsh, and London elections are the rest. You can see that on the whole, they're not, you know, they're not down here. They're not even below 10%. They're at least 10%. Sometimes they go higher. But they are always lower than the British general elections. And this is using these new kind of voting systems. So you can think of the difference between the red columns and the green columns as giving you an expression of how protected the major parties have been. So that gives you one measure. And then the second, and this is actually what happens nationwide. We've calculated this score. There's a very genius guy called Chris Henretti at University of East Anglia has calculated this by saying, well, when you're in each part of the country, how fair or unfair does it seem to you in that part of the country? So he's looked at, in each constituency, if we take the 30 nearest constituencies, and then we think about the vote share in those nearest constituencies, and who wins seats in those 30, we get a measure of what the level of deviation from proportionality is. And you can see the worst place in the country for deviation was Durham, because the northeast is very solidly Labour. You know, every seat for miles around is Labour. Not everybody for miles around votes Labour, but something like 40% of local votes there are never going to bear any result in seats. You can see the Scottish central belt is pretty Labour, and the cities, big conurbations, are Labour, and bits of London are Labour. Everything else down here is Tory predominant, so lots of Conservative winning seats. Almost everybody's Conservative, even though people are voting for other parties. And so the best areas of the country are in the southwest. So this is a very interesting. When I saw this map, I was fascinated.
So that means if you live in the southwest, just check out that your vote is more likely to give you an MP somewhere nearby.
Yes.
Who is of the party.
And you'll know that votes nearby are being sort of pretty properly and proportionately. And there are other parts as well, bits of Yorkshire and Lancashire and so on, where it's quite decent. And bits of London. So that's deviation from proportionality. The other thing that we need to think about is another very simple score called the effective number of parties. So basically we're trying to just get to one number that tells us how many parties are contesting an election. And the way we do this is we take the decimal vote share for the parties. So instead of writing 38%, we write 0.38. Then we square it, and then we add up the squared votes, and then we divide 1 by this squared votes total, which in this case generates a number of 3.21. What that says is, given a thing where 38% voted Labour, 38% voted Conservative, 35% Labour, 20% Liberal, 7% for others, that is equivalent to we've weighted it out as 3.21 parties. All right? So that's just a measure that allows for the fact that parties are of different sizes. And then we apply this to British elections. And this is what we see in the general election, that the effective number of parties is about 3 or just below or just above in the general election. It's been like that pretty well since 1974. And then we add in non-plurality elections, all the elections taking place using PR systems or the London Mayor system or whatever. And you can see that the number of parties is going to be is much higher. Now, of course, remember, we can't really get away with much less than 1.5 parties and still have a liberal democracy. The 3 looks as if it's well ahead of the 1.5, but compared with some of the other results where we're on 4.5 parties, in some cases 5.8 parties. And then the final thing to think about is the list PR election system. We added that in, and we have 5 or 6 parties really competing. So, and this is really where UKIP came in, especially in 2004 and 2009. They won 17% of the vote. And the British National Party won another 6 or 7% of the vote. And then in 2014, UKIP scooped the BNP share and got to 27.5. So the 2 ways in which, particularly, we've shifted to where we are now are the introduction of different kinds of elections that don't shield the Conservatives and Labour Party, and so PR and other kinds of elections, and the fact that we're having voting about different tiers. So these other voting things are about Scotland, Wales, London, and Europe. And we have different party systems at these levels, and that's what's brought about, eventually, after a long lag, change that looks as if it will be fairly dramatic in the main Westminster elections. Finally, this just shows you what's happened in the European elections in terms of the previous graph. This is where we were in 1999. This is where we were in 2004. We got even higher up the thing, really into ultra-proportional range in 2009. I haven't managed to put the 2014 numbers on this yet, but you can see a change over time as people got used to these different systems and realized that they could afford to vote without wasting their vote. So thanks very much for listening, and queries or questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. I mean, while people gather their thoughts, I was looking at the results from the London borough elections this year, the other day, and those Rowlings and Thrasher produced their figures for the elections. These are 2 people, academics, who produce a compendium of local election results, and they show that the vote share for the Conservatives and Labour is around 65-ish%. But actually, the share of the seats that the Conservatives and Labour won went up, and it's nearly to 90%. And the reason for that is that the 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th party vote is fragmenting in London. I think that's what's happening. So there's a kind of further effect, I think, which is that the extent to which in a 2-party system the non-2-party vote fragments allows the 2 parties to survive longer the more it fragments. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yes, well, I mean, London is one region of the country that's quite distinctive, and it's always shown a Conservative-Labour duopoly, really. Yeah. But it was challenged a lot by the Liberal Democrats, and they managed to establish some areas of strength like Richmond and so on. More recently it's been challenged by the arrival of UKIP, but UKIP has fared much less well in London than it has in other parts of the country. And so on the whole, London is a multicultural city. UKIP is a Back to the Future party, let's make Britain what it was in the 1950s, doesn't really have as much traction in London as in other parts of the country. So what you've seen really in London is the local government elections are some of the most scandalous elections ever undertaken in a liberal democracy. For example, Manchester is a completely Labour authority. There are no other councillors there. And there are historically
London boroughs. There are certainly some with no Newham, Barking and Dagenham, 60 Labour, naught as it were. Certainly for Newham.
Yeah. So actually, this is at the limit of a liberal democracy, where you have an election, then you say which party got the largest share of the votes. Let's give them all the seats. That if you did any more than that, you'd stop being a liberal democracy altogether. So it's interesting that in Scotland, one of the reasons that accounts for Labour's very sudden decline is the introduction of proportional representation in Scottish local government, which the Liberal Democrats and the SNP pushed through, and which has, badly dented Labour's historic protection. But you're right, there are still some areas where, protection is going strong.
Okay, yep. Question here, yep.
Yeah, you went through a comparison with the UK and, the US over divergence law, and you seem to suggest that the US sort of applies, divergence law applies much better to the US, but do you think that's more due to the Electoral College rather than to plurality voting?
Well, that's a very good question. Divergence law applies in all US elections pretty well. The question is that because they're using plurality rule voting, or is it because of some other feature of the American political system? And I think that's a really important question. And so all of American political science believes in divergence law, but that's because they see it working all the time around them, if you see what I mean. But if we look at all the other liberal democracies that use plurality rule, Canada, Britain, Australia uses a modified form, New Zealand used to use it but has now gone PR, and India, we don't see any other large political system using plurality rule that in any way conforms to the picture. So I think we can find a few island states like Jamaica and a few small Caribbean islands, as well as the USA. And the American political scientists always appeal to these strongly as if they're real countries, but the Bahamas is not quite really what I would think of as a whole country, if you see what I mean. And island polities often are two-party politics for various other reasons. So you just have to think, is the super duvergerian quality in the US perhaps down to distinctive features? You mentioned one of them, which is the Presidential Election College, which does tend to, award all the seats in the state in a block vote to whichever party came first, and sometimes produces results like the US president represents the second party, not the first party. But I think the real influences actually are two things. One is political finance, which really, is now completely uncontrolled in the USA. You can spend as much money as you like, and anybody can intervene in any election race and spend as much money as they like. That's the import of recent Supreme Court decisions. And that tends to mean it's really, really hard to get third, fourth, and fifth parties off the ground because you're competing with massive amounts of spending. And only very rich people can even begin to contemplate standing for big offices. The other thing is that the USA uniquely leaves the control of elections pretty much in the hands of state legislatures. There's been some Supreme Court regulation of them, but the state legislatures are ruthlessly, organized by whichever party is in control to gerrymander the constituencies, that they have to give proportional population proportional things, but they design absurd constituencies, in order to create seats in order to do this. And there's a lot of partisan fixing of elections, and really there's a lot of, it's not kind of the Putin level, but there's a lot of exclusion of candidates, really, that goes on in the US still. So I would tend to think those are the reasons why the USA is super Deviationian. And it's got nothing at all to do, well, very little to do with plurality rule voting.
Yeah, one here, and one there. So can you hold on for a moment while the microphone appears?
My question is the following. Are there any significant pressures in the UK to switch to a proportional system?
Okay, well, I mean, there are now significant pressures again for PR voting. I mean, there have been occasions in British politics where it's come very, very close to shifting to proportional representation. One was in 1917 when the new Representation of the People Act was being introduced. A second time was in 1997, actually, when Tony Blair had signed a constitutional deal with the Liberal Democrats, which included a commission to examine, a royal commission to examine, a commission to examine the voting system, and with a view to a referendum on whether or not there should be a change. In the end, Labour won a landslide majority thanks to plurality rule voting. Blair was planning to bring the Liberal Democrats into a coalition cabinet. He didn't have to do that. They implemented the whole of the pre-election deal, and a person called Lord Jenkins was given the task of looking at an alternative voting system for the House of Commons. A very nice historian, but not much of a political scientist, and he went away and devised the most complicated voting system that I have ever seen in my life. And I know because we were consultants to the Commission, and we argued with we never really got to talk to Lord Jenkins. We argued with the civil servants endlessly, trying to get them to see sense and to go for some simple system. They went for this really purist system. He announced it. It was a dead duck within 2 weeks, and Labour just refused to hold a referendum. So then the next big time is 2010. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats are brokering a coalition. The Liberal Democrats are now seized of the need to have a simple system, but they pick the wrong system, which is the alternative vote. And then they reach an agreement with the Conservatives which says there'll be a referendum on this thing called the alternative vote.
Can you explain what the alternative vote is, just briefly?
It's a system used in Australia and almost nowhere else in the world, where you have single-member seats. People vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on their preferences for whichever party they want. We count up the votes. If nobody's got a majority, we start eliminating the bottom candidate and redistributing their votes. It's quite a complicated system. Why on earth the Liberal Democrats went for it, I don't know, because they could have gone for the supplementary vote, which is the system that had already been used 3 times to elect the London mayor. Well, twice to, 3 times, and which is a very simple to use system and would have created a lot fewer things. So the then Conservatives, having conceded this to the Liberal Democrats, then go out and campaign relentlessly on the "don't let Nick Clegg fool you again" kind of line. This is a secret plan to get Liberal Democrats into every constituency in the country or whatever it is. So, and people don't like Nick Clegg, so they vote against AV 2-1. Now the problem is that what we've got is a medieval voting system which works perfectly well with 2 parties. As I said, it's very proportional in the USA. But we don't have 2 parties. We have 5 or 6 parties in every part of the UK now. And what the electoral system will do is it will work quite erratically. It will work in a way that's very hard to predict, and it will depend on very small shifts of votes. So a tiny shift of 1 or 2% of votes could produce crashing results in terms of outcomes. As far as we can see, a lot of people are going to vote UKIP, up from 3% in 2010 to maybe 15 or 16% now. If you'd asked me before the last few weeks what was going to happen to UKIP MPs, I would have said it would be lucky if there were any UKIP MPs. But now there's a couple who've won by-elections, so they look likely to be re-elected, and it looks as if things are not working out for the Conservatives, not working out very well for Labour. So I think there could be maybe 10 UKIP MPs. But they'd still be massively underrepresented because of the electoral system. The Liberal Democrats could lose maybe half their seats. The Greens could rack up quite a few million votes and get no seats, or one seat, or two seats maybe. Now, the question is, what does this mean for the next round of electoral reform? There definitely will be pressure for another round of electoral reform. But you'll be unsurprised to know that basically parties are very self-interested. They make up arguments to explain why they're not reforming the electoral system, but the basic truth is that until one or other of the major parties wholeheartedly decides that they want to have the top two parties, that they'd be better off in an alternative system, until they wholeheartedly do that, it's unlikely that change will occur. And then the question is, because of the botched AV referendum, what change could occur? And I think the main alternatives are, well, you could take the London mayor system, which is called the Supplementary Vote. I could explain how that works, but it's very simple to use. I don't know if you guys have all used it all already, but you basically just can vote for your first party preference and a second party preference. And then if no candidate has got a majority, you look at the second preferences. You eliminate all the other candidates except the top two, and you look at who's got the most votes when you count both preferences. I think you could introduce that overnight without a referendum, just by passing a law for Westminster. You could also introduce it for all local government elections, or you might go towards proportional elections because of the problems that we've already referred to. That, local government is very unproportional. That's one whole area, a possible very modest change, which would have a good deal of effects. Because what it would mean is that if we go back to this thing, you can see that there are relatively few Labour MPs and almost no Conservatives with a local majority. Well, there's a few there, but nobody with a big local. So it's only these blue-shaded and pink-shaded dots that have a local majority. All of these white MPs, that's the vast majority of them, the dots in the white area. We don't know whether they're really representing their constituents' views. And if you had something like the supplementary vote, or if you had implemented the alternative vote, which was rejected, you'd basically know which side of every MP would be able to claim majority support.
I mean, it's worth adding, isn't it, that we do have in the UK 4 different voting systems in use.
Oh, no, we've got 5.
Well, is it 5? Forgive me.
We've got plurality rule.
Right. Yeah.
Supplementary vote that we use for all our mayoral elections,
yes,
including London. Additional member system for Scotland, Wales and the London Assembly.
Yes.
List PR for the European elections.
And the STV.
STV that we use for Scottish local government elections and most Northern Irish elections.
And at some level, I mean, we've talked in previous weeks about the Constitution.
Yeah.
And this is yet another element, is it not, of the unwritten, or having an unwritten Constitution and the malleability of it, and the fact that every time we have discussions on serious constitutional issues on the floor of the House of Commons, decided in just the same way the Cattle Grids Amendment Act would be decided. I mean, that's more or less what, I'm not misquoting Martin Loughlin's lecture, I think that's more or less what he said. Is that a fair, that these things are constitutional and yet they're decided alongside everything else on the floor of the House of Commons by a sort of political, just, the normal political process of any other legislation?
Well, it's interesting that the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition has just recently announced the creation of a super mayor for the Greater Manchester area. Uh-huh. And they concluded this by doing a deal with the local authority leaders in the area, and they brought in a way of electing them which is the same as the London mayor. And so that's the first time, I think, a new voting system has been introduced without a referendum. The supplementary vote has extended from the London mayor and been used at the behest of the Election Commission as an executive decision. So that's why I think you could do the supplementary vote. But any other system of voting, I think you'd now have to have a referendum. In that sense, the Constitution has become more restrictive. The only other way in which we might move towards more PR is that Ed Miliband has said that Labour is now in favour of creating a Senate. It's not a reformed House of Lords, it's an elected second chamber, and that would almost certainly use a proportional representation system if it ever gets to implementation. And you will have your own views about Ed Miliband's chances of being in Downing Street.
Question here. Okay, you can pass that back.
So you sort of talk about how you think single member district plurality is almost undemocratic in certain cases. Comparatively, is there any evidence that when a proportional system is used, you actually have greater support in democracy or greater approval of the democratic system?
Well, there are some very well operating plurality rule systems with relatively high levels of support until recently that have suddenly begun to malfunction. The USA is one of them. For many years, the USA has had very high levels of public support, but now there's increasing disillusionment with the sort of over-polarizing of the process and distrust of politicians. I think there's every electoral system, every set of institutions has potential things that can go wrong with it. So, for example, Italy used to run a particularly odd kind of bicameral legislature. It still has a problem with constantly changing its electoral system and with relatively low levels of public trust, relatively high changeover and fragility of governments. So it depends really what you think of, but I'd say the most democratic societies in the world are all the Nordic and Scandinavian countries. They're very well established, they're very stable, they have a high protection of human rights, they have much higher happiness levels than we do. Generally speaking, I don't think we are anywhere in the top 20, say, of political countries in terms of stability. We have got a huge number of problems. We've piled them all up. We've got a huge problem now constitutionally, absolutely really serious logjam. We've got a serious problem in the voting system. I guess the only thing that really might force a change would be if the SNP does incredibly well in Scotland, Labour loses a hell of a lot of seats and thinks, oh my God, we ought to get some protection, let's buy some proportional representation, then we might see a change. Or we might see a proportional Senate or something of that kind. But will it improve the sum of human happiness? It's difficult to say, I mean, there are, I think what we should do is aim for in political institutions that are fair. I think it's very important that you all think about the current state of democracy in the world, which is not, healthy. We have a very big pushback against democratic ideals, against civil rights and human liberty, against freedom of the press. We have huge areas of the world run by authoritarian systems. We've got some semi-democracies like Russia that have suddenly lurched into, well, surprisingly antisocial behavior, let's put it that way. We have a huge region of the world. It's not a laughing matter. It's really a really serious development.
That's the way you put it, I think.
Yeah. But there's a whole serious part of the world that stretches from Nigeria all the way over to Pakistan, where the Arab Spring has failed, where there's been increasing rejection of not just democracy, but of anything that smacks of democracy. So, and we've had coups in Thailand, and established liberal democracies have been rolled back. So I think actually around the world, democracy is in very bad shape at the moment. It's under unprecedented threat, possibly not since maybe even as far back as the 1940s. You have to go to a period when the threats to democracy are as serious as they are now. And that's why it's incredibly important that the established liberal democracies are run in excellent ways, not just passable ways, not just okay, we can't justify it, but we'll keep on doing it kind of ways. You've got to have good, solid democratic foundations for everything you're doing. You've got to protect civil liberties. You've got to think really how you're going to balance up human rights and the needs of the state. If you just say, well, let the needs of the state go paramount, it's very hard to see a distinction between, what you're advocating and what semi-authoritarian states are doing. So I think getting to systems that reflect the balance of people's votes. If you have a liberal democracy, you create an institution, you call it a legislature, but it doesn't reflect what people have voted for in very large measure. That's a real problem.
I suppose there are two things. I mean, even the Swedes within the Nordic bloc, I mean, they've begun to have fringe parties, have they not, emerge into their system, suggesting that even in these arguably more perfect representative systems, or less imperfect representative systems, there is a degree of discontent which is beyond even the voting system. The other thing that this points me to ask, though, is what about the cut-offs that these PR systems so often have, which Israel doesn't have? I mean, most of them have a 5% cut-off. Is that does that sort of undermining representativeness?
When we were designing the London Mayor thing, we thought about this a long time, and we recommended to the then Labour government that they should go for a 4% cut-off. And they took it away into 10 Downing Street and consulted the Labour Party and did various things. And they came back with a 5% cut-off, which was mainly designed to keep the British National Party from winning seats, which it singularly failed to do in 2008, but then worked again in 2012. So any cut-off is a bit of a problem. You can argue that there's a democratic need to prevent over-fragmentation, which is the problem in Israel, that very tiny parties can win representation in the parliament, and then that becomes very difficult to keep the party system.
Some of these lovely quotients, though, presumably. It presumably makes them much better, some of these.
No, it's almost, you can't really get deviation proportionality below 4%, however hard you try. If you have lots of fragmented small parties, quite a lot of the vote will be underrepresented anyway. So cutouts, I think as long as they're at a moderate level, like 4, maybe 5%, that's the top. There are countries in the world that use very big cutouts. Turkey uses a 10% cutout, which has the convenient effect of tending to minimize the representation of Kurdish MPs in the Turkish parliament. At various stages under, the Yeltsin-Putin regimes have been very large cutouts. You have to stand in 10 of the republics of the Russian Federation, which is a very highly restrictive thing, especially when you have to run your application by the Kremlin before you're allowed to compete. So, there's an endless capacity to, you go into the micro-institutions, people rig a lot of elections worldwide. That's why we need to have really good quality elections by comparison.
Yes, Keith, very briefly, because we're going to have to go in 2 minutes.
Just one point you didn't mention was, and I just wonder how, this is a real question, not a difference of opinion, the importance of boundary changes or not. And clearly, the impact of it is disputed in the coming general election, but clearly the Conservatives kind of torpedoed themselves by the way they campaigned against PR, and then the Liberal Democrats reacted by refusing to let the boundary changes go through, which could make a difference of 20 seats. I mean, how important do you think that is, and the regular boundary changes in terms of ensuring a proper democratic system?
And the wider issue of districting.
Okay, well, I mean, in any electoral system, it's important quite how you draw boundaries around districts, and particularly in the UK, because it can make a big difference. There's currently 646 seats in the House of Commons. The Conservatives were proposing to reduce it to 600. It wasn't because of the AV referendum, it was because the Conservatives they betrayed the Liberal Democrats again on the pledge to introduce a bill for the House of Lords, or at least so that it was in retaliation for that the Liberal Democrats refused to vote to cut the number of seats. The strange thing is that the reduction to 600 would have hurt the Liberal Democrats very badly and would have hurt Labour. It would have just benefited the Tories. So the odd result now is that if Labour and the Labour and the Conservatives get exactly the same number of votes, because the Labour vote is more efficiently distributed, or at least has been, it may not be in, we don't know what's going to happen in Scotland where the SNP is surging. But if the SNP surge doesn't happen, Labour hangs on to its Scottish seats, then it will do. It could have more seats per vote than the Tories. Is that a democratic problem? Well, yeah, the size of constituencies varying is a problem. But then it's also important that constituencies in the single member thing bear some relation to boundaries, local authority boundaries. So I think, it's not easy to answer that. There are arguments and counter-arguments, and it's not just because of rigging that Labour will do better in terms of seats. It's because Labour votes are distributed differently compared to Tory votes.
And anybody, we need to stop actually, but anybody who wants to look at this in their own, at their own time, there's a rather good, simple but very useful, Electoral Calculus. There's online, if you find Electoral Calculus, you can put your own figures and your own swings into it, and then it will show you what a particular vote share for a party will, or the 3 parties or 4 parties they think they now will produce. But it also shows some of these distortions and how much more difficult it is for parties other than Labour and the Conservatives to win vote shares. It's well worth looking at. Anyway, thank you, Patrick. And you'll be back again next week. Thank you all.